Hey guys, Tiara here with Dr. Fitness, and today's video is all about my pediatric nephrology rotation. So today was actually my very last day of my pediatric nephrology rotation, and I honestly cannot believe it went by so quickly. I tried on several occasions to film a day in the life video where I could take you in the hospital with me for my pediatric nephrology rotation, but for many reasons, including how busy the rotation got, as well as how few opportunities I had to film in isolated locations where I could speak to you all freely without interrupting other people's work, I decided it probably would be best to just do a Q&A with you all and give you all my final thoughts on the rotation, and we'll try again for a day in the life video under better circumstances. In the meantime, let's get right to this Q&A and my final thoughts on my pediatric nephrology rotation. So earlier today, I invited all of my Instagram followers to ask questions about my pediatric nephrology rotation. Make sure to follow me on Instagram at .girlfitness so you don't miss another opportunity for your question to be answered on the next Q&A. So the first question I got was, what is pediatric nephrology? That's honestly a great question, and a lot of times when I would introduce myself to a family as a resident serving on the nephrology team, they looked kind of confused because they didn't understand what I meant. Nephrology just means the study of nephrons, and a nephron is a kidney cell. A kidney is made up of a bunch of nephrons that come together to form this organ. And so physicians who specialize in treating kidney disorders and diseases are called nephrologists. This month, I served on the pediatric nephrology rotation, meaning that I worked with attending or supervising physicians who were specialized in pediatric nephrology. Another question I received was, what is the difference between pediatric and adult nephrology? This is another excellent question because it is a common thought, and honestly a thought I had going into the rotation, that pediatric and adult nephrology would be very similar. It's true in some senses because at the end of the day, regardless, you are working with the kidneys, but there are also so many differences between the types of kidney diseases and disorders that children face in comparison to adults, but also how these disorders and diseases are treated. There also may be a similarity in the type of disease and therefore how the disease presents in patients, but the common causes could differ between children and adults. For example, chronic kidney disease, which is something you mostly hear about from the adult side of medicine, is something that also occur in the pediatric population. In adult males, the number one cause of chronic kidney disease would be diabetes. While in the pediatric population, chronic kidney disease is most commonly caused by congenital anomalies, and in young males specifically, the most common cause is posterior urethral valves. This is just one of the many differences between pediatric and adult nephrology. While you're in medical school, you have a lot more of an opportunity to be exposed to adult nephrology, especially on your internal medicine rotation, because many patients suffer from diabetes, and as a comorbidity of that condition, they also may have some form of chronic kidney disease or some other kidney disease. It's a lot less likely whenever you're on a general pediatric rotation to run into pediatric patients who suffer from something like chronic kidney disease or from another kidney disease. You may have exposure to it if you decide to do a pediatric elective in a subspecialty, but I did not do an elective in pediatric nephrology in medical school, so although I had been exposed to pediatric nephrology from the perspective of my preclinical renal course while I was in medical school, this was my first opportunity to be exposed to clinical pediatric nephrology, and it really was a great experience at that. Someone else asked me, how are the hours on this rotation in comparison to your last rotation? Honestly, the hours weren't much different from pediatric hospital medicine to pediatric nephrology because they are both inpatient rotations requiring residents to serve as either a short stay or a late stay person, as well as to do 1 week of nights and have about 4 to 5 days off for the entire month. The only major difference between this rotation and the last is that in addition to the continuity clinic I had 1 afternoon per week that I will continue to have for the rest of my time in residency, we also were allowed to participate in renal clinic. For every subspecialty rotation, not only is there an inpatient service, but also an outpatient clinic service. And I really appreciated that we not only had the opportunity to see what life was like on the inpatient aspect of pediatric nephrology, but we also got to follow up most often with the patients that we had just seen on the inpatient side of the rotation. We got to follow up with them on the outpatient side of things and not only see what acute issues are like on the inpatient side, but also to see what pediatric nephrology is like for patients that are doing well, that are clinically stable, and who follow up every 6 months to 1 year, depending on what kidney issue they have. So in addition to that continuity clinic that we had one afternoon per week, we would also go to renal clinic for either half a day or a full day every other week of the rotation. This next question kind of goes along with the last, but is a little bit different, and that question was the pediatric nephrology rotation busier or less busy than your pediatric hospital medicine rotation? So this question is kind of hard to answer because it depends on what you consider to be busy. If you mean busy in terms of the number of patients that we had on a regular basis, it wasn't much different from what I experienced on pediatric hospital medicine because at any given time we had about the same number of patients on our team. But with that being said, it was a bit busier in the sense of how complex each patient was and how much more I had to do with each patient that I was covering. On the pediatric hospital medicine rotation, most of those patients coming to the floor have a very acute issue. It's easily fixable within a maybe 3 to 5 day span, and then we are able to discharge them, and usually they are previously healthy or had maybe a couple of issues prior to this admission, but will be discharged and have a fairly normal follow-up, and they may never have another issue in their childhood. This differs quite a bit from the types of patients I typically saw on my pediatric nephrology rotation. There was the occasional patient who had a very specific kidney issue, and those patients were typically previously healthy, and then after that admission, they would follow up with a little bit more of a hands-on medical management outpatient for a longer time period than, say, someone on pediatric hospital medicine. But for the most part, they would not be considered a patient that was complex. But for most of the patients that we saw on the pediatric nephrology rotation, they would be considered complex patients, meaning that they had multiple medical conditions. As I said earlier, one of the nephrology conditions that you can see on this rotation is chronic kidney disease. And in the pediatric population, the number one cause of chronic kidney disease is a congenital anomaly. More often than not, if a patient came in with one congenital anomaly, they had multiple congenital anomalies that required very complex care and close management and monitoring, not only of almost every single lab value that we would draw, but also of all of their current medications that they came into the hospital on. Many of these patients were not previously healthy. Some of these patients had upwards of 7 or 8 other medical conditions, and because they had a kidney issue that was the primary concern, as the primary team, other teams that cover the other issues they have may be following along in their care, but ultimately, as the primary team, we would be the ones to make a lot of their changes to their medical management after consulting with those other teams, meaning that caring for each patient required much more interaction with other subspecialties, as well as much more time and effort and understanding of not only their current problem at hand, but also how that current problem affects all of the other medical issues they may be suffering from. In that way, the rotation was a bit busier, and it also required a lot of studying behind the scenes. Also, many of these patients required daily labs to be drawn, and a lot of their medical management was primarily based off of what those labs looked like that current day. As a resident, I had to be quicker on my feet to understand and discern these labs on rounds, because some of the patients had their labs drawn earlier in the day, while other patients would have their labs drawn later in the morning, and I wouldn't even be able to see the labs for the first time until I was on rounds, and then right there at that moment, I would have to explain what those labs meant, and also what that meant for how we would medically manage the patient for that day. The reason why their labs would be drawn at different times would be because sometimes, because of their certain medications they're on for their different medical conditions, their labs would have to be timed based off of whatever time they take those medications at home, and therefore what time they're taking them while they're currently in the hospital. Drawing all of their labs at the same time that a certain lab would already have to be drawn just made sense for each patient, not only because it saves the patient from receiving one additional poke for a lab draw, but it also saves on supplies, and it also saves on the amount of times that the phlebotomist has to come by to do the same thing. It's better overall for the patient and for all staff involved. It just means that as a resident, I really have to be on top of it with my medical knowledge so that whenever the labs do come back, if I have had a chance to go over the labs before rounds have started, great. that if I don't, I should still be prepared to provide some kind of understanding of how their current labs would affect their medical management for the rest of the day. This really differs from the pediatric hospital medicine rotation, where essentially all of the patients get their labs drawn at the same time because for the most part they are all previously healthy and there are no other factors affecting when they're supposed to be having their labs drawn. Most of those patients don't even require a daily lab draw, so a lot less of the medical management was dependent on daily labs. Because this rotation was so different, it really required me to think on my feet and also to be very adjustable to whatever changes I may face from patient to patient and day to day. Being adjustable is what residency is all about, and I'm really glad that I'm getting these opportunities to practice that at the very beginning of residency. Another question I received was, what is your typical day-to-day like on this rotation? I'll spare the details of the differences between a short stay and a long stay because I really kind of fleshed that out in one of the previous videos, which I really encourage you to go back and watch if you haven't seen already. But I will gladly explain the ins and outs of a late stay resident for this rotation because it does differ a little bit from a late stay resident serving on the pediatric hospital medicine rotation. Similarly to pediatric hospital medicine, the day starts at 6:30 a.m. when you arrive and you receive sign out from the resident who served on the night shift overnight. Then all of the residents on the team split up the patients on the list and then chart review. There's a little bit more of a chart review that is required for a patient on the nephrology service because, as I said before, these patients are very complex and you have to look at quite a few other things than you would on a pediatric hospital medicine rotation. Not only are you trying to look for their labs, but you're also checking on that patient's daily weight and how that relates to their input and output for the day. This is really important on a pediatric nephrology rotation. The purpose of the kidneys, among other things, is to filter. And if there's something wrong with the kidneys and they have an inability to filter properly, then something you have to be concerned about is either fluid retention leading to volume overload, or as the kidneys start to recover, they could have an increased rate of filtration leading to a volume depletion that may need to be corrected by starting IV fluids. A lot of these patients with kidney issues also have issues with hypertension or high blood pressure because the kidneys are very important to managing and maintaining a normal blood pressure. It really is fascinating how important the kidneys are to almost every single aspect of the human body, and also how these lab values, these vital signs, and these other tests that we take can reveal to us if the kidney is doing better or worse on a day-to-day basis. So pre-rounding in the morning or checking on the patients that we have taken over for the day is a little bit more involved and takes a little bit more effort. After we've pre-rounded, we go and we check on our patients and see how they've done overnight by talking with them and doing a full physical exam on them, and then also talking with their parents and addressing whatever questions or concerns they may have. We then have morning report as usual for 1 hour, and then right after morning report, we start our rounds for the day. Rounds are much more involved on this rotation for the same reason why it takes longer to pre-round on patients, and ultimately that's because each patient is just much more complex than what you would get on a pediatric hospital medicine rotation. While on a pediatric hospital medicine rotation, rounds are usually over by around 11:45 or 11:50 a.m. For the pediatric nephrology rotation, many times we would have to pause rounds for the morning, go to noon conference, and then finish up rounds in the afternoon, which would usually end anywhere between 2 p.m. and at the latest throughout the rotation was one day where we rounded until about 4:30 p.m. After we're done rounding on the patients, we check on them one last time, make sure they are clinically okay, and then we check to see if there's any changes in their lab values, if there are any afternoon labs that we've decided to repeat for them, and we also check to make sure their vital signs are still within normal limits, or if they're not within normal limits, that we have methods in place to correct those immediately. If you're the resident covering the late stay shift for the day, you'll receive sign out from those residents who have completed all of their work for their patients, and then the short stay residents will go home, and then the late stay resident will stay until 7 p.m. and then sign out to the resident covering the night shift. So as you can see, pretty much the same setup. There's just a difference in the amount of time that's taken for each of those parts throughout the day. One of the last questions I received was, did you love it or did you love it? and I will say I really did love this rotation. I don't know if this means that I want to become a pediatric nephrologist one day, but what it does mean is that I truly appreciate how vital this field is to pediatric medicine and how important it is to know how to medically manage a patient dealing with a renal issue. And therefore, even if I don't decide to go into pediatric nephrology, I would know how to acutely manage a patient with signs and symptoms of a renal disease. I know what labs and tests that I may want to order and how those tests could better help the pediatric nephrologist assess the patient before they even get to see them, which could really help get the ball rolling and give the patient quicker access to the type of care that they really need. Well guys, not only is that it for the pediatric nephrology rotation, but that's also all I got for this video. I really hope you enjoyed and that this helped give a better understanding of my experience on the pediatric nephrology rotation. If you liked this video, make sure to give it a big thumbs up. If you have any questions or want to chat, make sure to let me know in the comments below. And if you like videos about medicine, lifestyle, and fitness, then make sure to subscribe to my channel. I'll see you next time.